Hi, I'm Terrell Turner, the host of the Finance and Accounting Show. And today we have a great guest on. And one of the things that businesses really have to wrap their minds around is how do you start to get strategic about the financial strategy in the business? And one of the greatest resources that you could have is a financial planning and analysis mentality or an FP&A mentality. And a lot of times that comes with bringing the right people on your team, kind of introducing that thought process of how do we start to think about the financial impact of the strategy decisions, and how do we start to get a picture of what that looks like, whether that's modeling, forecasting, however you want to look at it. So I'm very excited to bring on my guest who does that for different companies and just helping people who want to just develop that FP&A mentality and that FP&A thought process. So stay tuned for today's episode. So without further ado, let me bring my guest on, Chris. Welcome to the show. How are you?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, FP&A is something that I am personally interested in myself. I mean, having been a director of FP&A, so I may seem a little biased for those that are listening. For those of you that are strictly accounting, I may seem a little biased at times, but I do think that there's a lot of value that Chris has to share. But before we jump into the details of that, Chris, can you tell us a little bit about your background?
Yeah, for sure. So I started working actually right during the financial crisis in 2009 in New York City for a consulting firm called FTI. And then after that, I went to Hilton Worldwide, the hotel company, did corporate finance and treasury with them for a couple years. And that's where I've got kind of my intro to FP&A, I guess I would say. And then from there, I spent the majority of my career in middle market private equity. And middle market's kind of an amorphous term, but I'd say companies that do 250 million or less. And so I did that for about 6 years, and then went out on my own in 2020 as like an M&A slash FP&A contractor, basically leveraging my private equity skills and turning it into my own thing. And so now I just do that remotely for a bunch of middle market companies around the US.
Nice, nice. One of the things that I'm always curious about is, when you thought about like kind of that first job of going into finance, it's just like, you know, what do you actually study in undergrad to prepare you for it? Because, from what I've talked to people and even from my own experience, it's not like accounting directly prepares you for FP&A, and it's not like finance directly prepares you for FP&A. So kind of what was that kind of educational background like for you?
Yeah, good question. So I was kind of a lost soul back then, honestly. I did have an accounting background, and I feel like that helped me at least understand the building blocks of business and sort of how the three statements were interconnected. But I didn't really get a bunch of forward-looking kind of FP&A exposure until I was on the job. I just sort of learned it as I was going. FP&A was still a very new term back when I first started working, and most people didn't even really understand what the acronym stood for. So the accounting education was helpful again because I could frame everything, but it wasn't until I was really on the job and we started building forecasts that I really honed my FP&A skills. So I don't think I got formal education. It was just sort of learned as I went, learned on the job.
Gotcha. Awesome. Now, one of the things you mentioned about, working for, Hilton Worldwide. I mean, when people think about, Hilton, they don't necessarily think about some of the back office functions like finance and FP&A. So, kind of what made you look at Hilton as kind of a next career move?
Yeah. So they actually, I spent some time working with them while I was at FTI. We were like a value add client for them. We were helping build a model to help them go public eventually. So this was way back in 2012, I think. And so just spent a lot of time on site, and I saw that they had an awesome culture there. I just made a lot of really great friendships, and I thought the finance work was fascinating because I could understand hotels. I could drive down the street, I could see them, I get it. Okay, like there's a physical asset, and it helped frame my models in a way that I could understand better. It was much less amorphous than when I first started. I worked on the Lehman bankruptcy and I was valuing derivatives, and I really kind of had no idea what I was doing. I mean, I learned it as I went, obviously, but like that's not very tangible. If I drive by the street and I see a Hilton, I get that. And so the combination of their business model and the people I met there just made it really, really attractive. And so my wife and I wanted to relocate at the time to Virginia where they're based. And so it was kind of a perfect fit for me to go pursue that as a next step.
Nice, nice. So now, what was it like? I mean, being, you said you started off in New York, and time of the financial crisis. When people hear about, anyone that works in finance, in the New York area, they immediately think, okay, Wall Street. They think investing. So what was it like working in that environment and kind of really, like I said, really doing more FP&A type work?
Yeah, that was really interesting because the financial crisis was so new at the time that still a lot of people didn't even really know what was going on. I spent a lot of time since I was just a first year consultant. I was kind of way down in the weeds. I wasn't doing as big sort of strategic finance stuff, but I was in the Lehman office. There are a lot of the empty boxes and all the kind of stuff you see from the footage in the movies, and we were just trying to how do we help value this one derivative portfolio as part of a global valuation to kind of help their FP&A purpose. So that was and that was just a really, really interesting time because that was my first foray into working, but yet I was trying to navigate a company that had just gone bankrupt. And so just trying to figure all that out as I was, 24 years old was kind of a really unique experience.
I mean, that had to be I mean, very unique from it's just like, okay, company just went bankrupt because even as I talk to people, that, as they hear about, hey, this company went bankrupt, the image that people hear in their mind or that they see in their mind is that, okay, all right, this company is worthless. So what was it kind of like? I mean, like I said, you're going through documents saying, okay, all right, there may be some value still left in this stuff, like, what was that like trying to figure that out?
Yeah, well, you have to forgive some of my bankruptcy recollection, but basically, the company is not worthless in most instances. You just have to go down and try to calculate a fair market value for the assets that are left, and then you just go in the order of what's called the waterfall, usually in the cap table. And so you're going to start with the debtors or the creditors, and then work your way down to the equity. And usually, the equity holders can often end up with nothing. And so that's sort of where the bankruptcy feeling or perception comes from. But most people in the cap table will take some kind of haircut on the value, and it's either gets liquidated or they try to restructure and move on under sort of a different operating structure in the future. So that's what we were doing. We were trying to value the derivative piece of this much larger Lehman asset and then see how that would flow down the cap table and the waterfall.
Gotcha, gotcha. So probably a very interesting time, and then, like I said, as you kind of segued in from that into working from Hilton, what was it about the Hilton experience that really appealed to you and kind of helped you prepare for what came after Hilton?
The thing I loved about Hilton was it was that there was a great culture there. So I had a great place to kind of learn and hone some of my modeling skills and some of my FP&A skills, and I learned about all these different departments that come with a large corporation. And so I feel like I was just able to sharpen things there in a great environment. And one of the greatest things I got exposure to there was private equity. They were owned by Blackstone at the time, and part of what I was working on was preparing a covenant package for Blackstone. And so we did a ton of detailed FP&A modeling, basically at the hotel level to help Blackstone assess its covenants and its equity return. And it's funny. I remember one day I saw in one of the emails that I got, there was this young guy on the email at Blackstone. He was only 32 years old, but he was like the very high up VP. And I just thought, wow, how can somebody so young advance themselves so quickly into this crazy role where they are in a sense a owner of Hilton, this giant company. And so that kind of fascinated me, and that got me into the self-study direction of How do I get into private equity? Do I want to be as big as like a Blackstone or a Carlyle? Probably not, but I liked more the middle market kind of entrepreneurial feel. And so that initial exposure at Hilton led me down the rabbit hole of kind of teaching myself private equity because I didn't have any traditional bulge bracket experience. I don't have a banking background or anything like that. But it was that exposure in the corp fin FP&A world that then led me to the private equity thing.
Gotcha. Gotcha. And that's interesting that, you mentioned about like the self education because sometimes when I talk to some people who have FP&A experience, is they tend to think like, oh, okay, if I understand FP&A, I understand all about finance. Like, were you surprised at the amount of gaps in your understanding about banking finance when you started doing that self study?
Oh yeah, and you know what? That still continues today. I mean, I feel like the more you learn, the more you educate yourself, the more you become self-aware that there's so much stuff that you don't know. And I think at its worst, that kind of leads us all to imposter syndrome, and we have to try our best to ignore that and just sort of try to keep improving a little bit each and every day. But I mean, yes, the value, I mean, the knowledge gap for me was huge. I just started reading a self-study private equity. I think it was an online course, and then I did a model, and I'm just thinking, wow, there is just so much here that I don't know, even though I had this really pretty sophisticated finance background from Hilton and FTI. So it's just kind of a self-realization thing as I was switching career paths.
Gotcha, gotcha. It makes me think about like back when I worked for a Fortune 500 company. I worked in investor relations, and I used to be on the phone a lot with Wall Street analysts as kind of reviewing their models, just seeing how they thought about our business. And then after that, I went to work for a much smaller company that was owned by a private equity, and it's just to see the difference in the mentality of when you are a major established company to when you are much smaller, like wow, the logic behind what you're aiming for as a private equity is very different from when you're just an investor in a bigger company, and that always amazed me when I looked at that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I found the same thing that once I went to the private equity world, the smaller shop, which is completely different to what I was used to. There weren't really systems in place. We were still working on building the website and all these like just totally different kind of like grassroots stuff that was completely different from Hilton, and that vibe really resonated with me, and that's why I stayed there for so long.
Nice, nice. So now, as you kind of continue down that path of, like I said, getting, you've gone from the major global impact of like, hey, the fallout of Lehman Brothers into Hilton, into larger private equity exposure to then kind of your middle market, kind of at what point did you kind of feel like, you know what? This is kind of the area where I want to kind of stay going forward. Like at what point did that kind of, your kind of future path start to become clear to you?
It probably happened 1 year into my private equity career because even though I'd worked at these really huge, impressive companies before that, I didn't quite understand the big picture. I was so far down in the weeds that when I was zooming out, I didn't totally know what we were solving for all the time. And when I got to private equity, I all of a sudden I had this context of, okay, this is how the world works. When I'm reading these headlines in the Wall Street Journal of so and so is acquiring this company for this and that, I finally understood how the pieces worked as I was modeling out those smaller deals that we were looking at acquiring companies and we had to bring in debt and equity to get that deal done. And suddenly I just felt like I had this perspective that like my eyes were open on just how the business world worked and how these transactions worked. And that really kind of got me fired up and inspired me to stick with it. And I knew that even if I wasn't going to stay in PE long term, I always wanted to be around like the big picture of business growth, business valuation, and like forecasting to kind of help build enterprise value, either be at the PE level or just helping entrepreneurs like with their startup stuff.
Gotcha, gotcha. Now, one of the things that you've mentioned a couple times is when it comes down to modeling and forecasting, and something that I realize that for a lot of the people who listen to the show is they may be serving middle market and they're kind of between bookkeeping with some CFO services, and then there are some who do have exposure to like your more advanced, complex kind of models. And so when you talk about forecasting and modeling, how deep and how complex are kind of the models that you kind of work with now?
Yeah, it's funny. They tend to get less complex as I get older because I think there used to just be too much detail, too much nuance, and as I zoom out and get to the bigger picture, the models are still complicated for sure, but I try to keep everything at the three statement model level as like the highest level, and then pick a handful of line items to go into detail on. Usually that's going to be revenue, probably headcount, the capital expenditures, and maybe some known contracts or like professional fees, something like that. The rest of it I try to keep as simple as possible because the models they just get complicated. They're always going to, I know nobody's ever said, "Hey, this model's too simple," right? They always grow, and so I know that that's coming, and so I try to keep the bones and the structure as basic as possible because there's always going to be an ask or a one-off thing that we have to tweak, and I want to make sure it doesn't take a week for me to build all that in because I originally made it too complex. So I try to keep it at three statements, couple major drivers, and the rest is sort of like a pretty high-level growth assumption. Again, just to keep it manageable.
Gotcha, gotcha. It's funny that you talked about that. I mean, the no one ever says like, "Hey, this model is too simple,"
Right. Yeah.
because it's kind of like I remember there was one role that I went into, and the model had to be like 40 different tabs, and some of the tabs were all interconnected, and unfortunately, there was once we ran into a circular reference, and the model would crash if you tried it. So you end up having we were doing it in Excel. So you ended up having to turn the formulas off, make your updates, and then it's just like, okay, all right, have all the updates been in, then turn the formulas back on. So, when you talk about like some of your complex models, like, you know, have there been some horror stories that you've experienced of like, different models that you kind of had to adopt or take over?
Yeah, yeah, you'll appreciate this one. So we had for a buyout that we were working on, the model that we were building, they basically had two business segments for this company. The models were so complex and so large in file size that what I would do was I would open up one file and then I would take a screenshot of it on my phone, and then I would open the other file and then try to reference it on my phone and make the changes between files. And like so, I probably did that for a couple months, and it was just absolutely exhausting. And we eventually found a way to simplify it, but I mean, just to be staring at it on my phone is like one of the least efficient things I could possibly do in building out a model like that.
It amazes me how like how detailed some aspects of a model can get. I mean, and especially with just the enormous amount of data and how easy it is to collect data. Like one company I was with where they made technology that allow people to pay for their parking on their phone. And it's like when you think about like digging into some of the details, I mean, there were thousands of transactions happening per minute to where it's like you have thousands of transactions happen per minute. And if you wanted to look at, let's say, it's 60 days worth of transactions, it's just like there was like no way to really wrap your mind around it. So, I'm sure that you probably experienced, like I said, the massive amount of data that's available to you when you're looking at different models. Kind of, have there been any tools that you've used, or what have been kind of your approaches to prevent your models from being too consuming with the amount of background data that's available?
Yeah, I've been, I guess, lucky enough that I had the data hasn't been so huge that it hasn't been at least kind of manageable in my models. I've done some manufacturing deals where there's tons of data. I've also done some grocery deals where there's like tons of transaction data. but it was just manageable enough that we had like, this just the slow breathing Excel file that made your fan whirl and that kind of thing. But we were able to get through it that I haven't needed an external data analysis tool. So I'd say that's kind of at least out of my scope of experience, but I know there's a lot of new stuff out there, or not even all that new, but like something like a Power Query where you can do some of that automated behind the scenes and pull that database info into your model really speeds up the efficiency and the file size. Thankfully, I've been able to avoid probably most of that, I would say.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, I remember I had this one computer where I would be in a meeting, and whenever I'd open the model, people would ask like, "Are we close to an airport?" Because like when the fan would cut on, it sound like an airplane getting ready to take off. And it's just like, no, that's just my computer.
Yeah, been there multiple times, multiple times.
Gotcha. So now with some of the consulting work that you do, what are the types of businesses and what are the types of clients that you usually work with?
So I work with all types of clients, but I'd say they're generally split into two groups. One would be like much more later stage, mature companies that tend to be, lower margin, like 30% gross margin, 10% EBITDA margin, that are steady state, and they just sort of need like a general FP&A presence. The other would be much newer startup SaaS-based companies, and I've really been enjoying a lot of that work because it's different from my later stage PE background. It's about, going out for series A, B, C, building cash runways, and even just modeling out SaaS is very different from traditional modeling because of the way that the cash flows work. So it kind of splits into those two groups for the most part, and everything is US based, at least so far.
Nice, nice. I think that it's a huge benefit that you provide for the SaaS businesses because there are so many SaaS founders that I come across that are excited about their idea, but they don't really have a concept of, like you said, how that cash flow, works, or just, how the cash flow is going to come in to be able to support this massive growth that they're projecting. You know, when you're talking with, SaaS companies, do you find that, SaaS founders are starting to grasp some of the complexity of like the growing pains of trying to grow too fast?
Yes, I think so. I think what I've noticed, at least for some of the clients I've been helping with, is they're bringing in a handful of pretty sophisticated finance professionals to help navigate building out those models and building out the runway. And that really helps with the founder or the CEO in terms of like knowing the big picture and the scope and really navigating the growth in their revenue and then comparing that to the growth in the head count. And there's a lot of pretty sophisticated and fancy metrics out there that we're using along the way that we can compare like to an industry benchmark to see, okay, how are we stacking up? And when we put all those together and look at the runway, it really does bring more of a process to it as opposed to just like kind of grow to grow and hire to hire, and hopefully it works. So I've been seeing a lot more of that with the clients that I've been helping in the SaaS space.
Nice, nice, nice. I always encourage, especially SaaS businesses because I think the growth can happen faster than they realize. And one of the things that I've seen happen with some companies is where they grew faster than they could wrap their arms around it, and they ended up having to go into an exit faster than they expected to. And because the growth got out of control, they didn't really get the right, I guess they didn't really get the full market value of their product because, they were growing so fast, they didn't have enough cash to support it. The company buying them knew that they didn't have enough cash to support it. So
Hmm.
the company buying them ended up getting a really, really good deal. And it's one of those things where I was just like, man, you guys should have had a finance person in kind of helping you see the danger signs down the road before you guys got to that point. It could have been very different for them.
Yeah, no, for sure. And actually, I'm partnered with a company called Bleecker and Jones out of New York that does that, and so I work with them on the SaaS clients, and it's the exact same thing. They will kind of come in and do a contract CFO engagement to get them through the early stuff, help them get the metrics, and sort of build that financial foresight. still at a cost kind of discount to a full-time team. And then when the company reaches some scale, they can bring in that full-time finance team, and there's a nice transition point there. So it really helps remove a blind spot early on, and I found that that's really resonated with the founders of the companies that we've helped.
Nice, nice, nice. Now, one of the other things that we talked about too is, some of the courses that that you have. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I have two right now. I'm always kind of got stuff in the works, but they're all based on pain and sleepless nights that I've experienced and stuff that I just wish I knew when I was younger. And one of them was, this very fancy private equity called LBO or buyout model, where you model out how the acquisition of a company is going to go. And I put this together during COVID because it was a quiet period for business. And I just was trying to recap all the knowledge that I'd learned in private equity that I wanted to teach my younger self. And so I recorded that. And then that led me to another thing of just putting out a 3 statement modeling template that I also have for sale, because I feel like of all the things that I've done throughout my career from a finance perspective, just knowing those 3 statements has been the most valuable by far. Because in my head, I can say, okay, if we have an expense or revenue or capex, I immediately in my head know exactly how that affects all the 3 statements and how it would affect EBITDA and how it would affect valuation. And so had I known that a long time ago, it just really would have helped me. And so I'm trying to create resources that would have helped my younger self. And so I'm always sort of working on that. And so every time I've got something, I put it up on my website for sale.
Nice, nice. Now, for those that have accounting and finance firm, let's say they offer CFO services, and that's not a skill set, would that be a product that they would find useful of that 3 statement model and template?
I think so, definitely. Yeah. I mean, it's immediately you can download it. There's less than an hour of videos just sort of walk you through how it works. You can tinker around in Excel and just sort of get a feel for it. So I think that's a pretty like broad spectrum. I think it would be really helpful for most people in finance, regardless of the area they want to go. For the LBO private equity stuff, you'll learn the 3 statements in there too. But I would say I would reserve that for somebody that's really focused on, "Hey, I want to get into middle market PE."
Mhm. Gotcha, gotcha. Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I would definitely say there have been some clients that I've worked with where you know they've hired me because they needed to understand those 3 statements because for all of the talk about accounting and the details of it is those 3 statements do a phenomenal job of helping people really understand what do you have your hands on financially, like what's going on. It kind of helps guide the strategy. So I'm glad that you offer that resource now, and people are interested in finding out more about what you do, and they're interested in finding out more about these resources. Where's the best place for them to find you online?
Definitely on LinkedIn. I try to post on there as much as I can, pretty much every work day, and post about the stuff that we're talking about. Private equity, FP&A, financial modeling. It's the stuff that I'm passionate about. The stuff I think I'm decent enough at least post about. And I always love to like meet new people on there and interact and that sort of thing. So that's if anybody wants to find me, that's where they can find me.
Nice, nice, nice. Now, one of the things that I'm very interested in is, that I find that a lot of accounting and finance professionals kind of struggle with is being able to narrow down their focus. Like I love the fact that like right up front, it's like, hey, I do 2 things. You know, how did you get comfortable with being able to narrow it down to that? Because I recently I did a video some time ago about and I called it like reasons why you need to fire your accountant. And one of the things that I talked about in there is if your accountant tells you like, hey, we're full service, we do it all. I tell business owners run away. Like like you want someone that actually knows what they do and not that hey they're testing it doing a couple of things. So how did you get comfortable really narrowing down to like, hey, I do 2 things? How did that happen for you?
It's a good question. It actually goes back to like the knowledge gap that we were talking about a little bit earlier. the more exposure I got to different avenues of finance, I just thought, man, like there's just so much stuff I don't know. And that's still true. And then but I would say, but I am really good at this one or two couple of things. I'm really good at building this type of model. When I say this, like a three-statement model or an FP&A budget. And I just had a lot of feedback from coworkers and people I've helped, like, hey, you're pretty good at this. So I said, why don't I just hyper focus on that? Let me get really good at that. And the other stuff that I don't know, I'll just turn it down, say it's out of my scope, or maybe refer it to somebody if I know somebody who could be helpful. But I wanted to be hyper focused on something that I could be good at so that I could actually be helpful. Because as a contractor, I hate the thought of like wasting time in somebody else's budget while I learn something to try to hopefully prove to them that I can solve their problem when in reality maybe I couldn't, and they would have been a better fit from somebody else. And I just want to take on the clients where I know, hey, I can be awesome at this, and I can do it really fast, and therefore much more affordable than you bringing on somebody full time.
Gotcha. I absolutely love that. I mean, and I always say is that, you know, even if you're an accounting and you're a finance firm and you're thinking about offering, FP&A services, especially if you're looking at middle market or private equity, it's more complex than you think. So definitely partner with someone that actually knows it instead of trying to test it and figure it out yourself. Because, if you're looking at what's in the best interest of the client, you want to work with someone who's navigated that industry and knows how that works. So I love that. Well, before we wrap up, one question I always love asking every guest that comes on is, when you think about where you've been and where you are now in your journey, what's two pieces of advice that you would share with other business owners?
Let's see. For other business owners, I would say the number one thing is to, let's see, I think I would say to have a true grasp on the financials, because there may come a day when you want to take your company to market and you're going to spend however long getting it ready to go to market. So if you're always kind of at the doorstep or mostly prepared to take it out to sale, it just gives you a ton of flexibility, and it also gives you a walk away. And actually, similar to your SaaS example earlier, they had sort of outgrown, they couldn't handle the growth and they weren't quite prepped for that sale. So I think if an owner can always be prepped to at least test the market, really, really helpful from like an enterprise value perspective, long term. And then I'd say the other thing is, in terms of just empowering the team and kind of creating a culture. I think we live in a different world now where you can't just expect people to be on all the time and grinding all the time, and nobody's going to buy into your vision the way that you do as the founder. So I think giving people some autonomy to just do their work, when they can do it, provided they do an awesome job. I think that's a nice empowering culture for a lot of people that doesn't have that micromanagement feel of just kind of going to work, going to the office. So if there's a blend of those two things, I think that can be really impactful.
Nice. I love it. I love it. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being a great guest. And before we wrap up, can you tell them one more time, if they're looking on LinkedIn for you, what are they searching for?
If you're looking for just to try to simplify the world of private equity, FP&A, financial modeling, I post about that stuff all the time.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, thanks for being an amazing guest.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Finance and Accounting Show. If you like what you heard, don't be selfish. Make sure you hit that subscribe button and then share this with a friend, because you know a business owner that could definitely use this insight. So be sure to hit that subscribe button, share it with a friend, and turn on the notification bell so you get all the updates when we release a new episode.